Aloha everyone, my name is Alessandro and this is the Temple of Surf, the podcast. We'll give you full access to the best surfers, skaters, shapers, surfboard collectors, shop owners in the world. Discover with me their stories, the greater successes, amazing behind the scenes, and much more. Aloha! Welcome to the 22nd episode of the Temple of Surf, the podcast. Today with us from California is a former professional surfer and current professional surf coach, Sean Mattison. We discuss with him about his amazing career, won Sol Surfboards, and much more. Hi, Sean, and welcome to the show. Where are you today?
I'm in Oceanside, California, and a little bit overcast. We have swell in the water.
Cool. Everything is like people can go to surf freely there is no confinement.
Yeah, I think everything is calmed down quite a bit, even though California has a lot of restrictions on what you can do, like going into restaurants. And it's interesting, when COVID first hit, I don't think anybody really knew what extreme, every state or every government was going to take to our freedoms, to be able to go and enjoy what we like to do, whether it's going out to eat or walking down the street or going into the ocean. And, so I remember, in March last year, when we first started getting the restrictions, literally they started closing down all the beaches. It was one beach and then that beach and then that beach. And some of the beaches stayed open because some of the beaches are city run instead of state run. So you saw like Huntington Beach being open still. And it was the craziest thing. Let me tell you, like, to see the beach all blocked off and you couldn't go in the water. And well, it was driving us crazy. And like literally a couple times, my wife and I drove up to Huntington, which is about an hour drive, just to be in the ocean, just to get in the salt water, because it was so mentally, tough. But for a little bit of time, they closed off parking, before they closed the beach entirely. You could surf, but it was like you had to spread out. So I think now people understand, the virus. That's all changed. They don't see the ocean as being dangerous. And, still people are precautionary, but, you have surf contests resuming again. Like yesterday, I saw a WSA contest at the beach, and it was so nice to see that, to a certain degree, trying to get back to normal.
Yeah.
And we even went out to a restaurant last night to eat, and we could sit outside, but you couldn't sit inside. So I think everybody has sort of their own opinion about how dangerous this is. It's a real virus, but I think it's always sort of like risk versus reward, how damaging it is to, whether it's an economy or a business. It's a real tough thing to see a lot of businesses go out of business because of the restrictions. And I just saw a lot of contradictions. So that part was tough.
Yeah, definitely there is no right way to approach. We never experience ourselves this kind of situation. So I guess with pragmatism, and it's the only way, of dealing with it, right? So,
Yeah.
And step by step. And I'm very happy to hear that there are contests going on, because that's so important. It's good for our mental health, that things go back to normality a little by little.
Yeah. And look, I think all of us share this common thing about surfing, is like what it does for our heads and what it does for our souls, and really what it means to us. And until it's taken away, you don't really realize how important it is to you personally. That's my takeaway.
I agree completely with you. Today we're going to talk about surf, your career as a surfer, as a businessman, your future projects. But the first question I ask everybody: in your opinion, what is the most important thing in surfing?
Oh, I think that's an interesting question, because I think that answer can change what it means to you from the beginning to the end. And I started surfing in 1974, and my mom would go and lay it out, in the sun to get a suntan. And I just saw people surfing. And this was in Florida. This was in the Atlantic Beach. And it just looked fun. And that's, I was 5 years old in 74 when I started. So it was about really having fun. And it was before like I had any friends that surf. When I went to like grammar school, like they call it kindergarten, I took my surfboard for show and tell. And so that was, like really young. And then I met my first friends that surfed. And then I started competing. And then, competing changed like the whole direction of what I wanted to do with surf and building friendships. And, so it becomes like a lifestyle. And your lifestyle is sort of like, what you like to do. And when I've often thought about what you are as a surfer, and it's more than just a sport. It's revolving around, it's your identity and your connection to the ocean. And I think that's kind of a common thread. And I think as I moved on from being a little kid to being a surfer, a competitive surfer, into all different aspects of surfing, I've tried to do everything I could to enjoy the sport, just be able to get the endorphins just to ride a wave.
Yeah.
And so, I just went through a total hip replacement, and I was out of the water again for 3 months, and I'm just getting back into the water. But it's just to get up and ride waves now. It's not about necessarily ripping a wave. It's about still being able to go and do what you love to do.
Yeah. That feeling that is so important in every life of surfer, no matter if you are a pro or just like you going on Sunday, right? Is
Yeah.
like,
So that's why I said it's a hard answer, a hard question to answer. What is surfing the best thing about surfing to you? It's a lot of layers there.
what was your proper first surfboard?
I bought my first surfboard from my sister for $3, and it was a board out of Australia. I can't think, it had a big logo. It said Shane on it. I can't think of his last name at the moment, but as soon as we're done with the article or the podcast, I know I'll remember. But he's an Australian guy, and it was a whatever board. But I think the board that kind of stood out to me the most was my first custom board. I think it was about 76 that I got my first, like surprise custom board. And it was a guy, Roger Woods out of Florida. And he made me this, and I got it for Christmas. And it was, ready on Christmas Day, laying up against the wall, but it had a rainbow bottom, kind of like this Lopez behind me. It was a single pin, glass on pin. And it stood out to me like that was my board. It wasn't like a hand me down or a, reject or something like that. It was like my first custom. And it was probably like, I'd say a 5-footer or a 5'2" or something like that, single fin with a glass on fin. But I have pictures of me riding that board and, with my puka shell necklace and, the early Quicksilver board shorts, the scallop legs, you see in all the famous pictures of Mark Richardson, those guys wearing, the early Quicksilver boardies and stuff. And it's just fond memories. And so I would say that's my first real board. Like it wasn't a hand-me-down, the one that just really made me take off about surfing.
And what happened to that board?
It's a sad story, actually. My mom, we had this little yellow pickup truck, and I was putting in the back of the truck. And like I said, it was like 5 foot or 5'2". And I saw all the other surfers with the tailgate lean the board up with the fin out like this on the tailgate. My board was too short to do that. It could have fit just perfectly in the bed of the truck. But I was telling my mom, like, this is how you do it. Because I saw other longer boards in the back of trucks with the fin hanging out.
Yeah.
And she goes, okay, if that's what you want to do, that's fine. So we start driving, and I'm watching my board out the back window of the truck. And I watch this the board start levitating. And then the next thing you know, it just starts spinning in the air, and it was demolished on the road. it, it broke off. Like it was destroyed.
That's a nightmare, right?
So yeah, I didn't have a happy ending with that.
But at least you got a lesson, right? You never put like
Yeah.
that size of the board at least. Let's talk about your career as a surfer. In your opinion, what was the defining moment of your career?
Well, I think there's, if when you have these questions and you reflect back, like what was some of the defining moments? I think, as I go all the way back, as you brought me back to some of the beginnings, I remember, I surfed my first contest in 76 or 77, something like that. And I won my first contest and went to the awards banquet. And it was the first time I'd ever seen like surf culture, the rock band, and they played surf movies behind the rock band. And I didn't even know that any of that existed. And so, here you're like getting all kinds of goodies, winning a contest with a big trophy. And, you see this whole new lifestyle. And even after that contest, I had what became my sponsor, this guy, Dave Hart. He came over to me and said, "Hey, I want to sponsor you." I didn't even know what that was. Like, what is a sponsor? And I said to him, "Look, you need to, I don't know what that is. You need to talk to my mom and dad. I don't even know what that is." And so I ended up getting sponsored and moving on to, doing more contests. And I won my first East Coast title in 1978. And in that same year, I made the finals of United States Surfing Championships, and I got third. So all of a sudden, I started being thrust into a surf culture that, like, okay, you have some skills, and this becomes the new you. Like, this is what your life's revolving around, and you start building relationships and building friends, and then the next thing you know, you surf contests every weekend, and that, I guess, that's what you're supposed to do, right? And so I think these are some of the defining moments in my career, because you want to see how that's going to all work out in like, this is the new you, and like competing became my life. And so I think as you start to world travel and compete, you have the highs and the lows, and then you have your dreams, and some of your dreams come true, some don't. I had big aspirations to be a pro surfer, but I think, have how to do that, especially then, wasn't real clear. You had a dream, but it's really hard for you to get there without major support or mentoring how to get there. So I think that, I had a lot of success and a lot of failures, and I lacked confidence in some things, and I lacked discipline in some areas. And so I feel like, say some of the highlights of my career is, I remember when I was a little kid going into a surf shop and seeing I think it was a picture of Dane Kealoha on it might have been Larry Bertelman. I can't remember, but he was doing a big layback snap, and he had a yellow board. I remember saying, "Gosh, that would be a dream to be on the cover of Surfer magazine." Mm-hmm. Right? Like, I think that's sort of like anybody's dream, like to be on the cover of a magazine and to, see your picture. And I remember, in the 90s, like, I really didn't know how that worked. Like, what do you do? Just surf, and some random person get your photo, and then all of a sudden you're on the magazine. Well, all of a sudden you start seeing how it actually works. You become part of a posse of, say, a staff photographer at the magazine. And, I built a relationship with a guy named Rob Keith, incredible water photographer. And, in the 90s, I started to see how that sort of works. Like, he's taking pictures of you so he can sell it to your sponsors, or he'll get photos run in the editorial, and that's how he gets paid. He's on salary from the magazine. But he says to me, he goes, "Hey, why don't we go down to Baja, and we can try to get, some photos for the California issue?" And I went, "Okay, cool." But you got to realize usually when he would go and shoot photos, there'd be like 8 pros with you and one photographer. So you're like all banging rails to try to get that one good wave and trying to line up with the photographer. So I was thinking, oh my gosh, I get to go with a Surfer Magazine photographer by myself. But we go down to Mexico, which is about, an hour and a half drive. And we get there and it's cloudy and it's onshore winds and it's not very good conditions for photos. And, I remember like going, well, we checked Baja Malibu first, and then it wasn't very good at all. So we decided that we would go over to the power plant in Rosarito, and we get there, and it just had morning sickness. And I said to Rob, I said, hey, why don't we just go out there and try? Even with the clouds or whatever. I was like, I didn't want to miss that opportunity. And he says to me, he goes, nah, why don't we just bail and go back, because there's the border between Mexico and the US. Usually there's like a long wait to get back through the border check. And he goes, why don't we get back so we can get through the border? It's not very good to shoot. I said, dude, let's just try. Why don't we try? He goes, I badgered him so much. He says, okay, just go out and I'll meet you out there. And so I paddle out, and at that time, you put film in your camera.
Okay.
You had housing and there's only 32 shots. So it's a lot of work to shoot film, and you have to be very cautious, or he did, how many shots you would take per, moment.
Yeah.
And not only that, but, you think about how hard it is to shoot water photos just in range. He had a 15 millimeter lens. So you had sort of like a few feet that you do the turn in. So anyway, I go out, and as I'm paddling out, it was like the hand of God just went, like the wind turned offshore, the clouds went away, the waves stood up. I mean, it was just like a switch got turned on. And it was mind. So he swims out, the wave that I got the cover eventually on, I just took off and I did a bottom turn and I did a layback snap. And I thought that I hit him. I just did one turn and went straight into the flats. And it was like at that time, you don't really know what you get. And, so we did our shoot. We were just kind of blown away that the conditions came together so fast. And I didn't even hear anything for months that we even got any photos. Like he wouldn't even tell me. And one of the reasons they never tell you, especially if you're in the running for a cover of a magazine, is number one, usually about, if you have 12 issues a year, maybe 3 of them are going to go to the world champ of that year.
Yeah.
And then as you start to look at the content, that sort of dictates, does it go in line with the magazine? Because sometimes they may get something all of a sudden that takes precedence over the cover because they want to promote, that photo shoot or whatever. So you may have like 10 great photos or more in line for that potential next cover. So they never tell anybody so they don't get excited because it gives them the chance to change. So, and by the way, usually those photos say you have 10 great cover shots. Some of them never even get run again or never get run. They make the cover good enough for a cover, but they never get used. So great cover, images never get used. So like the probability of getting a cover, you realize how extremely high that is. And just even shooting photos in water, like a water triplet on the frame or your hand outside the frame of the, the shot, or, it's just so many variables. So anyway, about 2 months later, I get a phone call from Jeff Devine. And, I've always looked at Surfer Magazine as sort of like the nucleus of the surf world. At least it was when we were kids. It's very different than Surfline and, all the Instagram and all this social media stuff. It really like, Kelly Slater and I and Bill Johnson and Tom Dugan. Tom Dugan took us in the early 1980s. We were out for the Keaton Pro-Am with the ESA All-Star team. And we were surfing at Huntington in that event. And while we were out here, he worked for Surfer and took us to Surfer. magazine. And we were like, I've got a picture of me and Kelly. Like, this is Kelly's first time at Surfer Magazine. Like, what, how many covers has he gotten over his incredible career? But, I've got a picture where we're holding our little like welcoming packet from the guys, but it was like larger than life to us, so to go into the same building and hear Jeff Devine, which is a famous surf photographer, he calls me and goes, "Hey, I want you to come down the Surfer. I need to talk to you." I didn't even know what it was about. I'm like, okay, like, okay. So, it's like, I don't know, a surfer's mecca. So when you go there, you kind of have sort of like, you have all your mental memories of when you were a kid and all these like historic images that kind of mold like the surf world to you. And, here I am walking up and he's like, the front receptionist says, "Hey, go upstairs. And, Jeff Devine wants to talk to you." And I walk up the stairs. And as soon as I walk up the stairs, Jeff Devine holds up the magazine cover and like, "You're on the cover of Surfer." And, like, to reflect back as a kid and remember like those dreams, that was a great dream that came true. That it happened to me. But you also realize that it didn't come easy. And there was some things that happened that were, I guess you could say, serendipity or by chance, and other things that, you're persistent. And so I look back at my career and go, that was really neat that happened. That was a dream come true in my career. But, I also look at, over 45, I think is about 47 years of surf. And I go, I've had a wonderful career from beginning to end because I've got to enjoy this in so many different ways.
It's amazing what you're saying, like definitely, as you said, everything came to a place, together, like the sun and the waves and the photographer and the 36 shot, very difficult to nail it. And then Surfer magazine cover. It's like, wow, right? You had to,
Yeah.
you had to
Like,
happen.
and no one can take that away from me. Right. And it's something that I cherish. It can be, you know, it can be perceived as something that's great. And some people go, whatever, to me, like with Surfer Magazine not printing anymore, like there was 50 years, maybe 60, I don't know, that they produced magazine, but they were the first magazine, in existence with international publication.
Yeah.
So it affected the world. And, it's sort of like, to a surfer to make a cover of Surfer, to me, it was a big deal. To the kids nowadays, they don't even understand.
So, different,
Right. I think.
different society and different, things go fast. You don't wait anymore for like I don't know, in Italy, we all going to this kiosk, the newspaper kiosk, and look for the magazine, right? And so there was a day that the truck was arriving and delivering the magazine. Now everything is fast on the fingertip, and every news is old. Next episode actually I'm releasing on Wednesday. I spoke with Shane Bashan, and he was telling me about the 1010 in Kira, the famous way.
Yep.
And basically told me like yet it has more success today than at that time, because at that time there was nobody on the beach, there was no social media, so basically nobody came to know about it. And now, because there is a video on YouTube and people asking about these triple 10, and it's like something is happening. But at that time there was no social media, so nobody basically knew that they did something is happening. So I mean, things change, but the stock remains, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's an important thing. You, in your career, you met a lot of surfer personalities. So you were referring to Kelly Slater, Jeff Define, others. It was a meeting with somebody, a surfer, that particularly impressed you, that you conserve a memory of it among all the others?
I think that I would have a lot of answers to that, because I think, you watch people's careers and you're inspired. You see a lot of people that have molded and shaped our world as surfers, their contribution, these small things. As we talk about Kelly, I remember when I first met Kelly, as an example. Well, Mike Tabling has passed away, but he's an East Coast Hall of Famer. And, he was a sponsor of mine in the early 80s. And I remember we went to Cocoa Beach and we were doing it was probably about 82 or 83, I think. He was doing a team tryout, and we went to Cocoa Beach, and I saw this little kid with a Ditka tree board with little footprints all over it. And he had mentioned Kelly, and that was the first time I met Kelly. And then as kind of years evolved, us, competing together, you just build relationships. So Kelly's brother, older brother, and he has a younger one too, is Sean Slater. And so Sean is my age, which is a few years older, like 3 years older than Kelly. And so we were like rivals, where we did East Coast Championship finals man on man together, competing against each other, and so we were friends and rivals. And that's sort of what happens, it starts becoming like this sort of family when you compete. Even though you compete against each other, you have these relationships, and you may go down and stay at their house, and then they'll come up and stay at your house, and that kind of a thing. And you start traveling together. And so, I've known Kelly a long, long time. And, it's sort of like just how that happens. I mean, even back in 84, like I said, with the, surfing the Caton Pro-Am together. And then, going down to Cabo together with the ESA All-Star team and the WSA All-Star team, with Peter Mell and, all these guys. You build these early relationships, and it just kind of evolves. You're sort of part of that nucleus of that generation. And so, I've always, and even when we were young, we would watch Kelly and just go, oh my gosh, he's going to be amazing. He surpassed everything that we ever imagined he would be 20-fold, not just tenfold, but he's still making, these new benchmarks. I mean, even having, the last Triple Crown, not this one, but the previous one, winning a Triple Crown, it's just amazing. And there will never be anybody like him. So, when it talks about Kelly, like, I, I have huge admiration for him, but I also, it's kind of neat that we've had that relationship from early on. I mean, when he went on to, I since I started, creating my own boards or having my own opinions about things, I found just through my, surfing and riding different equipment, the pros and the cons or the deficiencies or how certain boards work. And when I came up with the Nupster, I just wanted Kelly to try it, and I have huge respect for him and him understanding equipment. But I think it was perceived as, when you have two people that are on the same understanding and you want to share something and you want to turn somebody on, that was the whole premise. I just wanted him to try it. But for him to go on and compete with it and actually win his last world title with it and do some amazing things was, like, to me, sort of like I influenced him, but he influenced me. Like, he gave me a street credit that I could never earn. And, even to this day, I still manufacture and produce the fin for FCS. So I own the mold. And, so that kind of relationship is just one of those examples. And, same thing with, working with Mike Hinson. There's things that I smile and I laugh about, and other things I go, oh my gosh, that was not fun and not easy. And you see, guys like Mike Hinson, the star of the Endless Summer, and how much influence he's had. And just to pick up these nuggets and gems of wisdom and board design and concept, and working with him for 10 years was, priceless, because I couldn't be doing my Von Sol brand and building boards if it wasn't for that relationship of spending time with Hinson. And let me say it clear, like Hinson was not an easy person to hang with all the time, but they broke the mold when Hinson came along. He just was a super influential surfer that he built boards for Skip Fry and Billy Hamilton and Barry Kanani, all early on, and even having Lopez, just like this board back here, say Hinson made pipeline possible with his down rail, and his down rail from nose to tail. I mean, Lopez gives credit to Hinson, and so you kind of see how each person has sort of like their influence, and then they're influenced by others. And an evolution.
Yeah, and I would say they are all interconnected. It's like
Yeah.
one to one. Thank you for sharing these two memories. In effect, while you were talking, I read in some articles in the net about the winning of Kelly Slater of his 11th title, and they are saying that you were the mastermind behind his winning. Do you agree with that or no?
No, I think Kelly's the mastermind of his own winning. I think that like as an example, when I got Kelly that fin in New York for that New York event, he sent me an email going, this it affected him emotionally and gave him confidence. He felt like that fin made his board just a little bit better. And it's just a kind of an emotion. It's like when you get a board and all of a sudden you have the confidence in how you ride it, and it's such a good board. It does everything you want it to do. And when you feel the difference from changing fins from going one thing to the next, and all of a sudden becomes magic, it's an emotional like thing that he felt. So I can't say that I was a mastermind behind it. I feel like there was moments that it really gave him an emotional high about something that he felt a difference. But I can't say I was the mastermind of him winning his world title. But sometimes it's those little things that make a difference. It's doing like that in that event, him doing the air of his life up to that point in the last moments of a heat on a closeout with Taj Bro having priority is a moment. Him making the final in that event, that fin influenced him. But I, that's an opinion. Only he can tell you really where it's at. But that was incredible. That I watched that slow mo where he's doing it, air reverse and stomps it and gets a 10, and watching Taj's head go like this. And I'm watching it live because I'm like tripping that he even used my fin in the event, and he had it in both boards. Like it was a big deal to him, and he expressed it in the email to me. So, like I said, I mean, this is all controversial stuff, right? But I think that Kelly can get a 10 on anything. He can win at events, anywhere. It's just where's his headspace? To the moments come together right for him. So I don't know how to answer that question, but I tried.
No, you did. It's just like a curiosity. In effect, but just before asking you, I thought about your answer. Your answer was like perfect. Kelly Slater is the mastermind of himself, and then you helped him, in a certain way to find a better equilibrium.
Yeah, and it was a moment. Like I think he's had a lot of those moments. If you watch, these things that inspire him. He'll talk about things that inspire him, the reason he does something or the motivation. And I think some athletes are that way. They need to believe in something, or there's something that affects them mentally that gives them the whole purpose or mindset to do incredible things. And whether it's pain or whether it's a death, whether it's revenge or whatever, there's a lot that goes into the psyche of an incredible athlete. And Kelly's one of those guys. Like he's micro analyzed all the parts, his equipment, the location, how he competes, offense, defense. You think of all those parts, and he's mastered it. Does he win all the time? No, but but sometimes he just needs something to inspire him to be up there instead of just here.
No, I agree. Challenging makes actually a challenge make all of us better. In whatever we do, we are surfer or businessman or whatever. If we are challenged, we can improve. At least if we take it positively. Let's talk about you as a coach. The first question that I ask you is, what was the most important thing in surfing? If I have to ask you the same thing in coaching, what would you answer?
Well, I think with coaching, it was funny. I was with Joey Brand a few weeks ago, and Joey, for our country, is the most decorated coach ever for our country. And I think second would be Ian Carnes, even though he's a transplant Aussie. But Joey started his career coaching with me, right? He got into coaching and he told me, he goes, I started coaching with you. And then I told him, I started coaching with you. And see, there was like when I was a little kid, and I'll answer your question, like what it's about. But when I was a little kid, I remember when Joey was the top of the surfing world, some friends of mine said, hey, Joey Baran is surfing. And this when I was in Florida, said Joey Baran is surfing like down the beach at the Sea Turtle. And that was like 5 miles away from my house. So I had never seen in person a surfer like him in person. And so I ran on the beach 5 miles down the beach as fast as I could. And I got there and he was still surfing. And I sat on the beach. And when he came in, this is like one of those relationships I'm talking about. When he comes in, I walk over and I introduce myself. And like I think I was 13 or 14. And I introduced myself and he says, hey, have you had lunch? And I said, no. He goes, well, why don't we go get some pizza? And I was starstruck. And this was like in the early 80s. And this is before his Pipe Master win. And so we went to Mr. Gaddy's Pizza and, and like it was the coolest thing because he reached out to me like, hey, let's go spend some time together, which was amazing. And, this is like one of those relationships you just mentioned, right? So, over the years, like every time he saw me, he always talked to me and was like, he's always such a motivator. And, he makes you feel like you're on a cloud, that you're a great person and things like that. So when I moved from Florida to California, I ran into him and he says, I want to coach you. And I was like, whoa, okay. So, he ends up coming. I lived in this like beater, like rent, like old house called the Red House in Carlsbad. And my roommates, Joey Brand comes over and this is in Carlsbad and that's where he's from. He comes over and my roommates are freaking like, oh my gosh, Joey Brand's at our house. Again, that's post winning the Pipe Masters. So I started working with him and he was basically training me. And, when he was working with me, I was making back-to-back finals on the Bud Pro Surfing Tour. And it was a lot of hard work, but he eventually ended up moving away because he's in the ministry, preaching the gospel. And he moved to the East Coast. Then he moved back for family reasons. And I had moved out of pro surfing and into retail, working at Surf Ride, which is a retail store here in Southern California. And while I was here, he started working here at that store. I became the manager. And I heard when he came back, he was working at a plant store. And I was like, no way. So I reached out to him. I hired him to be a sales associate over at the store, working on the floor. It was super funny. So he was my coach. Like I was a Brom. I looked up to him. Then, he became my coach and then I became his boss. Right. And so now all of a sudden the relationship changed, but then we decided, hey, why don't we start getting into like coaching kids for marketing purposes for the store? And we started working with a lot of the Groms, to give guidance. And so we got into coaching, both of us together to keep coaching these kids. And we went on to, like Julia Christian, she went on to win an ISA World Gold Medal through us coaching with her, amazing things, out of that whole coaching. But that's where I got started with coaching. And as the coaching got more and more serious, like I remember going to Janice Aragon with the NSSA, and I asked her, "Hey, can I get some referrals from you to coach some kids?" And she said, "Well, who have you coached and what have you done?" And it was this really important question to me, because what makes you legit and who endorses you was really the question she was asking. What makes you better than somebody else?
Yeah.
Right. And then I realized that, I needed to work my way towards credentialing and this and that. And so I spent a lot of time, eventually evolving in. I think the first time I worked with the US team was in 2002. And we went over and we got slaughtered. And I think Jordy Smith won the men's at that time. I could be wrong. Somebody will correct me, but it was in Durban in 2002. And, and it was sort of like, getting involved. But ironically enough, when Surfing America reformed and now it's USA Surfing, you see all the politics in surfing, and sort as you get higher and higher up, you start to see the politics of it and how it kind of works. And I was sort of like on my method of just getting credentials, just like legitimizing myself. But it was neat. Like Joey and I ended up, Peter Townend was one of the founders of Surfing America in the early 2000s. And then PT was the coach of the USA team. And then as he was going to step down, PT called me for Joey's number, which was classic. And Joey ended up, and this was about 2007, 2008, Joey ended up taking over the US team. And then I went on again with the US team, because there was a little space of time where I left coaching with the US team, then came back with the US team, and I coached with Joey. And it's amazing how all these pieces intersect with each other, how these relationships go like this. PT was Joey's personal coach when he was on tour.
Okay.
PT and Ian ran the NSSA, and I was on the NSA national team. My first time out at Sunset when I was like 14 or 15, I paddled out with Ian Carnes at Sunset. And it was like 8 to 10 foot, biggest waves I've ever seen in my life. And so, like, you see all these intersections of these relationships. So, here you have like the reform of, USA Surfing, with the goal of eventually going to the Olympics, and PT running it, then stepping down, Joey taking over. And as Joey and I worked together, we did a lot of world events in the ISAs. And then he eventually stepped down. Then Ian took over that position. We all applied for it. He kind of had hopes that I would take over that head coaching position. But Ian, being number 2 in the world and starting the ASP, he had much higher coaching credentials. Plus, I mean, he was the coach of the NSA national team. He has just a lot more experience than I have. And I ended up being his assistant coach, and we went on to win an ISA World Gold Medal. So, I think when you ask the question, what is important to coaching, it's there. You coach out of what you know, and you coach out of your experience. And, as you deepen those experiences, this is how you become a more legit coach. I found that my strength, like me and Joey, when we were together, it was like a marriage. I was really good at technical coaching, technique, strategy. I mean, I had some amazing heats with Courtney Conalog and with Aloha and Dino, and where it was all out of strategy and identifying what they were doing and coach them through heats to win. And like some of the most amazing coaching experiences in the game that I ever had. And it's priceless. And we had those moments together with those great athletes. But I found that Joey and I complemented each other in our style. He was very charismatic and, got everybody, like emotionally stoked. And I was very detailed in strategy. If playing offense, defense, and kind of playing the game. And it was really neat, that experience. But when I ended up coaching with Ian, Ian is very environmental, like knowing the break and how it works and how you need to approach it. Like he taught me things that in all of us, when we were on the team, like he comes from Western Australia and how to surf around rocks. And I'm from Florida beach break. And here, like, you don't have the same kind of like big tidal changes and heavy water. And, how, like, when we were coaching in Costa Rica for the ISA Worlds, he was telling them, when you go coming towards that rock, attack the rock, aim towards the rock. And as the water comes off the rock, bang off the refraction, and that will take you into the inside. I never heard of that. I would be turning around the rock instead of aiming for the rock. And so, again, he was sort of like a general and I was a corporal, and there was a different role. We weren't like evens. We were like, I kind of was part of his, chain of command, and very different, but it was really a neat experience. And, I had, just with my equipment knowledge, I was able to work with some of the surfers. I remember working with Courtney, and when she was, practicing, she had these fins, and I said, Courtney, why are you using those fins? Because they were very different than anything she's ever had. And she goes, well, I just felt like it, which is it's an okay answer, but you realize like certain board designs and certain fins work at certain breaks. And I had her change her fins, like where it was before, like she couldn't even make a wave. And it was just devastating her, no confidence. So I had her change these fins. And then all of a sudden, and kind of change the angle she was going on the wave. Then all of a sudden, instead of being behind the wave every single time, she was in front of it. And it gave her a lot of confidence. She went on to win the world title in the ISA, and that helped us get, the ISA world gold medal. And by the way, that's the last in the open division that our country has gotten. And it was so cool to get, a trophy from the IOC, which is recognized as a world win, just like an Olympic gold medal, even though we're not there yet. So I think coaching for me is sort of like a way of giving back, and it's fun to me. And, I've learned things that I wish I knew when I was a competitive surfer, and then it's sort of guiding people in a way to evolve. And I mean, if you surf better, you have more fun.
Yes. It's in fact, it's something that you said at the beginning, if in a certain way, if you had that kind of coaching at the beginning of your career as a surfer, most probably you would have done much, much better, right? But it was different time. So,
well, I think everybody makes a choice, like in things. I watched an interview of Kai Lenny, and he was talking about really like his world is about training. Like he doesn't really have time for all this other. It's kind of like he's on a mission, and you have to make really big sacrifices. And like with me in the early career, there's things that are in your control and some things that are out of your control.
Okay.
So just like what the kids are experiencing now, like there's a lot of things. If you want to be a pro surfer now, it's out of your control because COVID, right? Here COVID is close beaches down, the whole marketing, how business works and how money circulates. Like some of the tours don't even have any money. So back in those days when I was, on the brink of trying to be on the world tour and all that kind of like that, chasing my dreams, they had the first Gulf War. We were involved in, Iraq and Afghanistan and, all this stuff. And, you just see how global economy or your country's economy can affect you, and you're doing everything right, but it's just out of your control. So, to that end, that's one factor. Another is, relationship. Like I got married when I was 21 and had my first kid at 23. And those are choices I made. But, when it comes down to it, if you're single and you're putting everything on the line, that's a lot easier than having, a family and having to provide. It's a lot of pressure. And that was one of the determining factors for me to redirect early on instead of pushing it all the way I could. is responsibility. I just didn't want to have like a lot of debt and not be responsible.
Definitely. We talked about you as a surfer, then as a coach, and then you will tell us as well what are your future projects as a coach. And then we talk about you as a businessman, right? With the Von Sol brand. Are you happy of the success that the the brands and your product especially have received so far?
I think, for me, it was more, because I'm artistic and I'm opinionated, like all of us. I I've learned a lot over the years from so many people, and I understand how boards work. I kind of wanted to see if I could do my own thing, and so I was together with Hinson for about 10 years, and when we separated, I was kind of already like the production manager, team writer. We collaborated on designs. I I was really the money behind everything and running the business then. And I was like, okay, I'm just going to do my own thing. So, I drew my logo. I literally sat over there at my table and put music on and started coming up with names and logo styles and things like that, and ended up with Von Sol. And so Von means of the, and the origin of, and Sol the sun. And if you see right here, I have waves drawn upside down in the waves. And the hand meant, catch the vision, but in a lot of different cultures and religions, it means, good luck to you, or, be good on to you. And a lot of different meanings actually. But you find that, they use it in the Middle East. They use it. The Indians have that symbol, and it can also mean the all-seeing eye of God. So it was fun for me to see if I could do my own thing. And so, in some ways, like I've never had a bar like this is what I want to be, and this is, I never imagined to be in the surfboard business. It's not a easy business, and there's actually a lot of like jealousy and competition and all that kind of stuff. But I don't care about any of that. I just kind of do what I do. And, I felt like I didn't ever want to be a big business. I want to own my business. I want to be able to be in control instead of the business being in control of me, if you understand what I'm saying. So, to have my board brand, be sustainable, and I still get to do what I like to do, and have my hands in it, I'm blown away. And I just came out with some t-shirts where I did this other logo. I did that logo like 10 years ago. I drew it and never really did anything with it. And I think last year I made some little like rice paper laminates for in between the fins. And so I just started like, printing the logo on some t-shirts, and I sold out, like blown away. Like people dig the art. So, it's like, I'll never be or want to be, a big brand, but, every bit of success that I've had has been out of word of mouth. People ride my boards and dig what I'm doing, and they just turn on other people, and then they come back for more, and, build the quiver around that kind of stuff. And that's really been the success of my business, because I don't have all the hype and all the marketing, and nor do I want it,
I understand. Like actually, it's a choice and it's a very respectful one. In not all of the brands, all of us, they just do marketing, right? The product speaks for you and for itself. So if you have a product that is recognized as quality and is performing, in case of surfboard pin, then definitely it's going to be a success. It's just a matter of being patient, right? And do the right choices at the right time. Okay, so let's talk about your future projects. What you're currently working on.
Yeah. So some of the future projects I have, it's funny. I try to be careful because, as an example, I have about 70 models. Some I've even forgotten about. Like, I end up going, oh, let's try this. And then it gets to a point where it's like too much, and it starts becoming like cannibalism to, some things. And I try to keep it, like, find this balance of going, create, and sustain, where you have like, it's like we have a hamburger place here, like In and Out Burger,
Oh yeah.
and they have a simple menu. It's hamburgers, fries, and drinks. Simple. And you can get them with a bunch of different patties or whatever. And so I kind of like think of this thing. I remember when I worked retail, like the skateboard business changed models so much, you can never keep up.
Yeah.
And I, I don't want to be that brand where I'm constantly creating new things, but at the same time, that's how I'm wired. Like as an example, like right now I have a model called a mid shadow. By the way, I mean, I just had a hip replacement about 4 months ago. I've been back in the water about a month. And so I'm kind of on the mission to rehab and, surf good again. But I had been riding, big boards just to help catch waves and get up easier. And so I just did some keel fish right before my surgery, and one I absolutely love. So, and you sort of like take all these bits and pieces and put them together. And you, a lot of times you can create something by morphing a couple things. So I'll kind of give you sort of like how this thread works. You think about the car industry, they have chassis, right? And so you could call a chassis a rocker, the same thing, like the nose to tail curve. And like that curve works really good in certain styles of boards. And so like I had a lot of success with this board called the Flying Manta. So I took, and it has a real down rail, like an instant rail, a down rail. And I find down rails like go super fast. They ride high in the wave instead of sliding down the face. And I love how quick they are. So this rocker and this rail, I love. And so back in the day when Hinson and I were doing boards, we had a Twinser fish, and it had a certain style of tail, which was curved, but kind of like more pointy. And that model, the Twinser, I remember the first time I rode that Twinser back then, it was so fast. It was blowing my mind. And I was like, whoa. And there was like a lot of things going on. So there's always these seeds of going, okay, let's use some of that DNA and use that as sort of a concept. And what did I like and what did, and back then that board was so fast, and you get anything over like shoulder high, you were sliding out. And that gave birth to evolve into the Black Knight quad with Hinson and I. And so going back to twin fins and going back to those kinds of things, I love how fast they are, but usually control and having that board feel positive is always the negative. So back then, we never had I didn't have the concept of using the trailer or the nubster for control, nor did we kind of like think about, we just love the effect, but we went to a quad to kind of control it instead of a keel. So what I've done is, I've taken this rocker from my Manta, the rail like a Hinson, and put the tail template like the old Hinson that I really liked, and then put wood keels on it. And the board is insane. It's so fun. So there's sort of a movement of riding some twin fins again. And so I've taken another model called a Shadow. The Shadow was the first board I hand shaped and did for my own brand. And I shaped that thing, and it took me forever to do it. And then I scanned it before I even wrote it. And that model has been the best model of my brand for over a decade. And so I made a mid shadow years ago, and everything was, a $5, where you can ride it as a twin fin, right, whatever. So just recently, I've gone to use the shadow, the mid shadow, like I'm using a 7.0 and glassing on wood keel fins, and I'm going to see how that goes. So, you kind of go, you use some of the things you experience, and then you go and try different things, and some suck and some are great. So I have a lot of ideas what to do. And then obviously, just recently I've been printing some shirts and hats and all this kind of stuff. And people are digging all that kind of stuff. And I was really quiet with it. And I realized what social media does. I mean, literally, I made a couple dozen t-shirts. I sold them in the first day. I posted them up on Instagram. And then, so I've just ordered another 6 dozen and I have half of them sold.
Wow.
So it's just really cool. I don't think that I have really capitalized on the whole ability to social media that much. And, so, and by the way, like with the whole surfboard brand, I've been really trying to model my business like, a lot of the brands have had a lot of success. And, I look at Takayama and, I have some finished shapers that, I have, working on some of my boards. I create the designs and then I have some guys help finish it. It just frees me up to test boards and to, get the brand where I want it to be. And, it's just, there's just a lot of layers. I look at, which I really appreciate the guys that can, shape a board from start to finish, make their own fins, glass their own boards, sand their own boards, do everything. But, I realize that those guys can't run a business, you like, it's so much, and they're not machines.
Of course.
People aren't machines. And, and I just find that, people always want deals and surfboards and they don't realize, especially guys like that, how much physical labor goes into a surfboard. And, so to be able to, do this kind of stuff, I try to look at the big picture of the brand and how it works and, what gives me, I'm very selfish with my time. I would rather be at the beach than, moving blanks around and, policing things,
Yeah. Definitely. And that's also one of the reasons why sometimes the boards in California are late because all the shapers aren't going to surf. If they can do, that's the best thing to do, right? Is not to shape.
Yeah.
It's just
Yeah. I hire and fire myself daily. That's been so neat for me going from being an employee and then being my own business is, you get to run the business the way you want to do it, despite what people say. And I really, really enjoy my lifestyle. It's great.
We're going to finish our interview with a short Q&A session. So please answer the first thing that comes up to your mind. Okay. The best surfboard that you ever ridden.
That's 47 years of, hey, when I worked at Surf Ride, we had 50 brands. I rode between 5 and 7 boards a week.
Oh, wow.
I rode every board in the shop so that I had an opinion about it. That is a big question. I can tell you one of the most favorite boards I have now is that twin keel. Best board of all time. I don't know if I can answer that question right away. I have so many. That's overwhelming. I
No problem. No problem.
Yeah.
Your favorite shaper of all time?
The most respect I have is Al Merrick for running a business and doing amazing things. My favorite shaper. Wow, that's a tough question again because like I appreciate the sculpting aspect of boards, and then you have the functionality of a board. Yeah. I think you have huge respect for Skip because he makes his own boards. You look at Hinson, he had his own style rail and had his moment. But as far as even Donald Takayama being an incredible nose rider, but as far as my favorite shaper, I would have to, even though I rode for Al only a short period of time, but I think that he's probably the most influential to modern surfing shapers of all time.
Personal question: your favorite song?
Well, I really it's a mood thing, because I go from reggae to blues to jazz, and you start to get into songs that affect the mood of the day. So there's a song called "Lost and Found" by, I don't even know the name of the guy who did it, a guy in Kauai. And anyway,
I'll find out. Somebody
Okay.
that did Lost and Found. Cool. Your favorite surf spot?
I really like surfing the Oceanside Harbor and North Jetty only because it's convenient and I like the wave. For around here, it's one of my favorites.
Your favorite surfer?
Sporting wise, by the sport, Kelly is one of my favorite surfers, because he has a classic style. And my other favorite is Tom Curran. I was talking to somebody in the water the other day and talking about Curran. And, when we were little kids, Curran influenced, including Kelly, like multi-generations of how to surf. You can go back to Curran's footage from Bells with Aki in 85, 86, and he would win heats today. And you just look at the fundamental of power surfing and the beauty of style and compression and explosion and carving. And, to me, that's the foundation of good surfing. I so appreciate, the aerial attack and, the rotations and creative moves like Italo Ferreira nowadays. But, sometimes you look at their style to set those maneuvers up and it's not really how my mental DNA is. So Curran and Kelly for sure are my favorite surfers. Curran for like timeless and Kelly in evolution of keeping up with contemporary and having the DNA of classic surfing.
I agree with you. The last question is a little bit unusual. We ask everybody on the show, nothing to do with surf. We want to know your best relationship advice.
Best relationship advice is say you're sorry, admit when you're wrong and own it, and be kind and listen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's there is a lot to learn in all of those, right? And
I've been married 30 years, and you have your ups and downs. And when my oldest son is 28, and I have a 21, 25, and 28. And when you raise your kids, you go from the beginning of a relationship. Who my wife is now is so different from when we first got married. We were young. I mean, we were teenagers really. And, I got married at 21. She was 20. We were engaged for a year. So I think you have to learn how to coexist and evolve that relationship. And then you start to understand each other better. And if you go like this, or it's always about you will never understand the other person.
Definitely. Is about compromise that keeps the couple stronger, right? And the family together. So
yeah,
I agree with you. Thanks a lot for your time, for being on the show. I look forward to talk to you very, very soon.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much. Ciao.
All right, ciao.
Bye. Hi, it's me again. I hope you enjoyed our today's episode. If you want to know more about us, please follow www.thetempleofsurf.com and all our social media. Mahalo!